A man in Phoenix was working full-time at an Amazon warehouse and sleeping in his car behind the building where he worked. Not because he was addicted to drugs, not because he gave up, because rent went up faster than his paycheck, faster than his savings, faster than reality itself. And here's the part that should make every American uncomfortable. That story is no longer rare. In 2026, homelessness in America is no longer confined to dark alleyways, abandoned tents, or people society has mentally categorized as different. It's spreading into the working class, into suburbs, into families with jobs, into people who did everything they were told to do. And once that starts happening, a country changes. Because homelessness was never just about housing. It's about trust. Trust that if you work hard, you'll survive. Trust that society has some kind of floor beneath you. Trust that one bad year won't erase your entire life. That trust is collapsing in real time, and most people still don't understand how serious this actually is. Because when Americans picture homelessness, many still imagine a very specific image. Someone disconnected from society. Someone visibly unstable. Someone standing on a freeway exit with a cardboard sign. But the new face of homelessness is quieter. It's the nurse sleeping in her SUV between shifts. The college graduate living in motels with 2 roommates. The divorced father working DoorDash until 3 a.m. because child support and rent together became mathematically impossible. At first, this looks like a personal failure, but it isn't. It's structural pressure building inside a society that has quietly become unaffordable for millions of ordinary people. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because America spent decades telling people that financial stability was mostly a reflection of personal responsibility. Work hard, stay disciplined, make smart choices. And for a long time, enough people experienced upward mobility that the story felt true. But what happens when millions of disciplined people still can't stabilize their lives? What happens when the economy keeps growing on paper, while human beings feel increasingly disposable inside it? That contradiction is now impossible to hide. You can see it in cities like Los Angeles, where entire blocks feel permanently overwhelmed. You can see it in Portland, Seattle, Chicago, New York. But now it's spreading far beyond major urban centers. Smaller cities are breaking too. Places that once considered homelessness a big city problem are suddenly dealing with exploding shelter demand, rising encampments, and working families living out of extended stay hotels. Why? Because the pressure moved outward. When housing prices exploded in major cities, people relocated to cheaper regions. But eventually those regions became expensive too. Then investors arrived. Then rents surged. Then wages failed to keep up. Then inflation hit necessities: food, insurance, utilities, healthcare. And suddenly, one emergency became enough to destroy someone's stability. A broken transmission, a medical bill, a layoff, one missed paycheck. That's all it takes now for millions of Americans. And the scariest part? A huge percentage of the country knows it. Most people aren't terrified because they see homeless people. They're terrified because they see themselves. That's why the emotional atmosphere around homelessness has changed so dramatically in recent years. There's more anger now, more anxiety, more tension in public spaces. Because people subconsciously understand this isn't happening over there anymore. It's getting closer. And once a society starts feeling economically cornered, something psychological begins to happen. People stop thinking long-term. They stop trusting institutions. They stop believing sacrifice will eventually pay off. And when that belief disappears, social cohesion starts eroding with it. This is why homelessness is becoming more than a housing crisis. It's becoming a legitimacy crisis. Because governments keep announcing economic growth, while ordinary people feel poorer. Corporations report record profits, while full-time workers sleep in parking lots. Luxury apartment towers rise next to tent encampments, like 2 different civilizations occupying the same street. That visual contradiction changes people. Over time, it creates emotional numbness mixed with quiet resentment. And eventually, societies normalize things that should horrify them. Children growing up near tents becomes normal. People overdosing on sidewalks becomes background scenery. Human suffering becomes urban wallpaper. And once a country adapts psychologically to that level of instability, reversing it becomes much harder. But here's the part nobody talks about. Homelessness doesn't only damage the people experiencing it, it changes everyone else too. It reshapes how citizens interact with public space, with empathy, with trust, with fear. It slowly teaches people to emotionally detach from each other just to function. Because if you fully absorbed the scale of suffering surrounding modern American life every single day, you'd emotionally collapse under it. So society adapts by looking away. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of all. Because civilizations rarely collapse the moment conditions become unsustainable. They collapse when dysfunction becomes psychologically normal. And America may be getting dangerously close to that line. If these kinds of stories matter to you, the ones beneath the headlines, the ones exposing what society is quietly becoming, subscribe. Because understanding the problem is the first step before a country forgets how to solve it. In many American cities now, there's a strange moment that keeps repeating. A luxury gym opens across the street from a homeless encampment. A $14 cocktail bar fills up every Friday night while people sleep under the freeway 2 blocks away. And everyone keeps moving, as if this is somehow sustainable. That's the unsettling part. Not just the homelessness itself, but how quickly the country learned to live beside extreme contradiction. Because America in 2026 feels increasingly divided into 2 completely different realities occupying the same physical space. One reality is still consuming, still traveling, still investing, still posting productivity advice online. The other is surviving day to day, one emergency away from collapse. And the distance between those 2 realities is shrinking fast. A few decades ago, homelessness was often associated with the absolute margins of society. Severe mental illness, chronic addiction, long-term unemployment. Those problems still exist, obviously, but they no longer explain the scale of what's happening. Now the pipeline into homelessness looks disturbingly ordinary. First comes debt, then rent increases, then a layoff, a breakup, an illness, or childcare costs. Then savings disappear. Then the couch surfing begins. Then the motel. Then the car. And eventually, the street. Not because people suddenly became irresponsible, because modern economic life has become brutally fragile. And this is where the American myth starts cracking apart. For generations, the country sold an idea that stability was earned through effort. But effort means less when essential systems become disconnected from human affordability. Healthcare costs don't care how disciplined you are. Rent doesn't care how hard you work. A landlord doesn't care if you missed payment because your child got sick. The system continues moving, whether your life survives it or not. And once enough people experience that reality personally, something dangerous happens politically. People stop believing institutions exist to protect them. You can already feel it spreading. Distrust in government, distrust in media, distrust in corporations, distrust in the future itself. Because when people work constantly, yet still feel insecure, they begin questioning the legitimacy of the entire structure around them. And honestly, can you blame them? A generation ago, a single income could often support a household. Today, many dual-income families still feel financially underwater. Young Americans delay marriage, children, and home ownership not because they're lazy, but because stability keeps moving further away, no matter how fast they run toward it. And this creates a psychological condition that economists rarely talk about enough: permanent uncertainty. Human beings are not built to live in endless instability. When survival feels unpredictable for too long, the nervous system changes. People become more anxious, more impulsive, more emotionally exhausted. Long-term thinking disappears because the future itself stops feeling reliable. That's why homelessness isn't just an economic issue. It's a mental and emotional signal being sent across society, a warning flare. And the terrifying thing is how many Americans now silently relate to it. Even people with decent jobs increasingly feel like they're performing stability rather than actually possessing it. They look financially functional from the outside, but internally, they know one disruption could unravel everything. That feeling changes a culture. It creates quiet panic beneath ordinary life. And this is where things get even darker, because when societies become economically strained, empathy often starts collapsing too. At first, people react to homelessness with concern, then frustration, then resentment. Eventually, many stop seeing homeless individuals as human beings entirely. They become viewed as obstacles, nuisances, visual pollution. Not because people are naturally cruel, but because chronic exposure to visible suffering psychologically overwhelms the brain. Compassion fatigue sets in. The public stops asking, "Why is this happening?" and starts asking, "Why can't someone remove this?" That shift matters, because once a society prioritizes aesthetic comfort over human recovery, policy changes too. Cities start focusing on visibility instead of solutions. Move the tents, clear the sidewalks, increase policing, push the problem somewhere else. But homelessness doesn't disappear when you relocate it. It spreads, like pressure escaping through cracks in a wall. And here's the irony nobody wants to admit. America is simultaneously one of the wealthiest societies in human history and one of the most psychologically insecure. People have more access to entertainment, technology, and consumer convenience than ever before, yet millions feel profoundly unstable. Why? Because human beings measure safety less by luxury and more by predictability. You can survive without extravagance. You cannot psychologically thrive without some sense of future security. And for a growing number of Americans, that security is evaporating. The result is a country drifting into emotional exhaustion, workers burned out, families financially cornered, young people disconnected from hope, communities increasingly fragmented. And homelessness becomes both a symptom and a symbol of that breakdown, a visible reminder that the line between stable and unstable has become frighteningly thin. But here's the part nobody talks about enough. The crisis isn't only spreading geographically, it's spreading psychologically. Even Americans who aren't homeless are beginning to think like people under survival pressure. Short-term decisions, emotional fatigue, constant financial anxiety, hyper-individualism replacing community trust, people pulling inward because collective systems no longer feel dependable. That's how social fragmentation accelerates. Not all at once, gradually, quietly, until one day an entire nation realizes it no longer feels emotionally connected to itself. And by then, the damage is already deep. There's a moment that happens to many people experiencing homelessness that almost nobody talks about. It's not the first night sleeping in a car. It's not losing the apartment. It's the moment they realize society now sees them differently. Less eye contact, more suspicion, more distance in people's faces, as if crossing an invisible line suddenly transformed them from a citizen into a warning sign. And maybe that's what makes America's homelessness crisis so psychologically disturbing, because it exposes how conditional belonging can become in a hyper-competitive society. As long as you appear productive, stable, employable, you remain visible. Once you fall outside that framework, people begin looking through you instead of at you. That realization breaks something inside many people long before the physical hardship does. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for America specifically. Because the country was built around a powerful idea: individualism. The belief that people shape their own destiny through effort, ambition, and resilience. That philosophy created extraordinary innovation and economic growth. But it also produced a darker side, a tendency to interpret suffering as personal failure. If someone succeeds, they earned it. If someone collapses, they probably made bad choices. Simple, clean, emotionally convenient. Except reality is rarely that simple. And modern homelessness is exposing the limits of that worldview. Because when hundreds of thousands of people begin falling through the cracks simultaneously, the explanation can't just be individual weakness anymore. At some point, the structure itself has to be questioned. But questioning the structure creates emotional discomfort. Because if the system itself contributes to instability, then anyone can become vulnerable. Not just other people, anyone. That's why homelessness creates such a strange emotional reaction in the public. People swing between empathy and hostility, because the crisis subconsciously threatens their own sense of security. Seeing someone living in a tent forces an uncomfortable thought into the mind. What separates me from that person, really? And in 2026, the answer feels less certain than it used to, especially for younger generations. Millennials and Gen Z grew up hearing promises about opportunity, education, and upward mobility. Instead, many entered adulthood during financial crises, exploding housing costs, stagnant wages, and a cost of living that rose faster than their ability to build stable lives. So now you have millions of people doing what society asked of them, while quietly feeling betrayed by the outcome. That emotional contradiction matters, because societies function partly on belief. Belief that tomorrow can improve. Belief that sacrifice has meaning. Belief that institutions, while imperfect, fundamentally work. Once enough people lose that belief, social trust begins collapsing from the inside. And trust, more than money, is what keeps countries stable. You can actually see this erosion happening in real time. People retreating from public life, distrusting neighbors, avoiding downtown areas, feeling emotionally detached from institutions they once respected. Even architecture starts changing. More gated buildings, more private security, more hostile design benches designed so nobody can sleep on them, spikes under bridges, fenced-off public spaces. Think about what that means psychologically. A society redesigning itself not to solve suffering, but to avoid looking at it. That changes the emotional atmosphere of everyday life. Public space becomes more tense, more fragmented, more defensive, and eventually people stop feeling like they belong to a shared society at all. Instead, everyone starts operating like isolated survival units, competing for shrinking stability. That's one reason homelessness spreads fear far beyond the actual numbers involved, because it symbolizes downward mobility. And downward mobility terrifies Americans. Not just economically, existentially. America's identity has always been tied to movement upward, progress, reinvention, the idea that life improves over time. But homelessness represents the opposite trajectory, falling, losing ground, watching stability disappear despite effort. That directly collides with the national myth people were raised believing. And when national myths start breaking apart, societies become emotionally disoriented. You start seeing rising anger everywhere, but nobody fully agrees on the cause. Some blame corporations, some blame government, some blame immigration, some blame addiction, some blame capitalism itself. But underneath all these arguments sits the same core emotion: fear. Fear that the system no longer protects ordinary people. And fear is one of the most destabilizing forces in any civilization, because fearful populations become easier to divide, manipulate, radicalize, and emotionally exhaust. Meanwhile, the actual human beings suffering inside the crisis often become background characters in political warfare, discussed endlessly, rarely understood. And here's the tragedy hidden beneath all of this. Most people experiencing homelessness don't need miracles. They need stability before instability compounds. Because once someone loses housing, everything else starts collapsing rapidly. Sleep deteriorates. Mental health deteriorates. Employment becomes harder. Relationships fracture. Documentation gets lost. Medical problems worsen. And the longer someone remains trapped in that cycle, the harder re-entry into normal life becomes. Homelessness is rarely a single catastrophe. It's usually a chain reaction, a slow unraveling, which is why prevention matters far more than most societies realize. But prevention requires long-term thinking, and modern America increasingly struggles to think long-term about anything. Everything becomes reactive. Political cycles, média outrage, temporary fixes, short attention spans. Meanwhile, the structural pressure keeps building underneath the surface, quietly, relentlessly, like stress accumulating inside a fault line before an earthquake. And the frightening thing is, you can already feel the social tension rising. A few years ago, seeing tent encampments outside major American cities still shocked people. Now many barely react. That emotional shift should alarm everyone. Because when human beings adapt to visible societal breakdown, it usually means the problem has moved from temporary crisis into permanent reality. And history shows something important about permanent instability. Once people stop believing conditions will improve, they begin emotionally reorganizing their lives around decline. That's the stage America appears to be entering now. Not collapse in the dramatic Hollywood sense. Something quieter, more psychological. A slow normalization of insecurity. You can already see it in the language people use every day. Just trying to survive. Everybody's struggling. One emergency away from disaster. Those phrases weren't supposed to define life in the richest country on earth. But now they sound almost ordinary. And maybe that's the deepest warning hidden inside America's homelessness crisis. Not simply that more people are losing housing, but that more people are losing faith. Faith in institutions, faith in economic mobility, faith that the future will be more stable than the present, and societies can survive hardship longer than they can survive hopelessness. That's the part policymakers often miss. Human beings are incredibly resilient when suffering feels temporary. People can tolerate sacrifice if they believe it leads somewhere meaningful. But endless instability without visible improvement creates emotional corrosion. Eventually, people disengage from politics, from community, from empathy itself. And this is where things become dangerous. Because disconnected societies don't just become poorer, they become colder, more fragmented, more hostile. When people feel chronically unsafe, they naturally pull inward. Self-preservation takes priority over collective responsibility. Public trust weakens. Social bonds thin out. Everyone becomes more suspicious of everyone else. That's why homelessness affects entire cities psychologically, even for people who never directly experience it. It changes the emotional texture of public life. You stop relaxing in public spaces. You stop feeling connected to strangers. You stop assuming society is fundamentally stable. Over time, that constant low-level anxiety reshapes behavior across an entire culture. And this is where America faces a profound choice. Does the country continue treating homelessness primarily as an optics problem? Or does it finally confront the deeper forces driving it? Because the truth is, homelessness is rarely created by one issue alone. It's housing costs, healthcare failures, mental illness, addiction, wage stagnation, isolation, family breakdown, economic volatility. A society can survive one or two of those pressures at scale, but when all of them intensify simultaneously, entire systems begin straining at once. And that strain is no longer hidden. It's visible in overwhelmed shelters, visible in rising street tensions, visible in exhausted workers living paycheck to paycheck, visible in young adults delaying basic life milestones because stability feels unattainable, visible in the quiet panic spreading beneath everyday American life. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. A society does not become healthy merely because markets perform well. GDP can rise while emotional stability collapses. Stock prices can surge while loneliness, despair, and insecurity spread underneath. And maybe that's what this crisis is truly exposing. The difference between economic growth and human well-being. Because modern America optimized aggressively for productivity, efficiency, and profit. But human beings are not machines. People need dignity, predictability, community, rest, a sense that their existence matters beyond economic output. When those things disappear, societies start producing symptoms of emotional decay everywhere. Addiction, rage, burnout, alienation, distrust. Homelessness is one of the clearest visible symptoms. Not the disease itself, the symptom. And until the deeper emotional and structural fractures are addressed, the crisis will keep spreading no matter how many temporary cleanups occur. That's why this moment feels different from previous eras. The pressure is no longer isolated. It's systemic. Middle-class Americans feel it. Young people feel it. Retirees feel it. Even financially stable people increasingly feel haunted by how fragile modern life has become. And when an entire population starts feeling psychologically precarious, societies enter dangerous territory, because fear changes how nations think, how they vote, how they treat one another, how much suffering they tolerate before responding. History repeatedly shows that civilizations rarely decline because they lacked wealth. They decline when too many people stop believing they share a common future. That's the real threat emerging beneath America's homelessness crisis in 2026. Not only economic instability, social fragmentation, a slow unraveling of the invisible trust that holds millions of strangers together under one national identity. And rebuilding that trust will require more than policy. It will require Americans to confront a difficult question. What is a society actually for? Is it merely an economic machine designed to maximize output? Or is it supposed to create conditions where ordinary human beings can live with dignity, stability, and hope? Because if a nation cannot answer that question anymore, the homelessness crisis may only be the beginning. And if you've stayed through this entire conversation, you probably understand something most people instinctively feel but struggle to articulate. This story was never only about homelessness. It was about the emotional condition of modern America itself. If these kinds of deeper conversations matter to you, the ones that go beyond headlines and force us to examine what society is becoming, subscribe, not for outrage, not for noise, but for clarity. In a time when clarity is becoming rare,